Now, without further ado, let's welcome Tom McDonald from Evolve L&D. Tom, the stage is now yours.
Thank you ever so much for that introduction and for having me and for running this event, because it's no small feat to put these on over multiple days. Um, Thank you everyone for joining. For me, it's the afternoon. It's nearly the end of the day. It's 4 o'clock, and my last full week of work of the year. So I'm in a good mood, which is great. What I do need from all of you is to be as active as possible in the chat. I'm going to be coming to you for a couple of kind of Q&As directly. Please be active, because otherwise it's just me talking for like an hour, and no one needs that in their life. If you need to see what happens when that does happen to someone, meet my wife sometime and she will tell you how truly terrible it is to just listen to me rabbiting on and on and on. With that, let me bring up the slides. Couple of general notes on slides. If you'll have been to a session with me before, you may be familiar with some of these general notes. First things first, I'm dyslexic, so almost definitely there will be spelling mistakes and potentially even some fun grammar mistakes in this presentation. There may even be words that don't really exist. Well done for you if you can spot them. I'm going to be really honest and say I don't need to know about them. So spot them, keep tally yourself, discuss amongst yourselves. The other thing is, you can absolutely have the slides if you want them after the presentation. They are, however, going to be utterly useless without me, I'm afraid. There is one that is actually handy, and I will draw your attention to it when it comes up. No flash photography, the slide may get frightened if you do. Now, I'm going to be talking a little bit about data, or more accurately, using data to inform our decisions. Now, what that doesn't mean is that this is going to turn into a maths lesson or a data analysis seminar. That would go really badly, because to be totally honest with you, I'm not a great data analyst. I'm not a data scientist, I'm not a statistician, I'm not even a researcher in any real terms. What I am is an L&D practitioner that wants to make better decisions. And that is the angle from which we're going to be looking at data-informed decision-making here. With that in mind, I think the fairly obvious place for us to start this conversation is bees. Yes, bees, the funny little furry insects that go around pollinating all our plants and making honey, without which, of course, we would all, cease to be alive. Bees are really important. But we're going to try and kind of stay roughly on track and talk about data, specifically what bees have to do with data. Now, is anyone here, and please let me know if you are, because I will very quickly be able to find my people. If so, do you know what the waggle dance is? Let me know in the chat. Are you familiar with the waggle dance? Excellent. I've got an immediate yep from Greg. We're going to get on, Greg. I like that. Negative. It's bee communication. Yes. Nope. Okay. Good. I'm really pleased at how many people here are familiar with the concept of the waggle dance. Did a similar talk where we talked about bees in person not long ago in person. No one put their hand up. Made me really sad. So, the waggle dance is the way in which, or a way in which, bees communicate. And what it basically is a series of rapid movements and some pheromones being released. But what it does is quite incredible. It tells an entire hive of bees where they can find pollen, resin, the other bits and bobs that bees fly off and collect. And it does it incredibly accurately. It's not like, oh, generally speaking, northeast of here. It conveys general direction, what the climate's like, if there's any danger along the way. It's really quite incredible the amount of data they're able to convey to other bees with this very simple process. But that's, strangely enough, not what we're interested in. The thing that's really fascinating about the waggle dance is that 80% of bees perceive it and pretty much go into autopilot. They receive that information from the waggle dance and they go, okay, there's only one thing I can do here. Do exactly what I've just been told. Travel in this direction, navigate the following dangers, get to this location, collect the things that the dance told me were going to be here, return to hive, repeat. Somewhere in that, they themselves also transmit the waggle dance. This is what we could best describe as data-driven behavior. Information has been received, information has been acted upon. Data point said to do this, action was complete. Fantastic. It's an incredibly effective and efficient way for bees to die. Because if bees only ever did this, what happens when that food source runs out? What happens on the day the bees follow the waggle dance, get there and go, ha, no pollen, no resin. What do I do now? The waggle dance can't tell them. Being data-driven is incredibly effective, incredibly efficient, but is dangerous. Now, I said that applied to 80% of bees, and yes, we really are still on bees at this point. I told you the slides weren't going to be that useful for you. The other 20% are wired fundamentally differently. Now, I'm using the term wired again, as well as not being a data scientist. I'm not a neuroscientist. I'm the wrong person for that, so I'm using it in the broad sense of the term. The other 20%, rather than being data-driven, take in this information, go, oh, the waggle dance, there's this over there and there's that over there, and this other waggle dance that I'm picking up over here does this and it does that, and it says there's stuff over there. I've got no information about this space over here, better go over there first. They are our adventurers, our data gatherers. They don't ignore the waggle dance, they take it in, they take that data point, and they use it to inform their next move. The other data points they consider are like, what's the state of the hive? Are we desperate for food at the minute? In which case I should probably go and help them get some. But if not, then there is a risk here that this food might run out at some point, and so I need to go and investigate somewhere else. It's a much more complicated decision-making process. And the reason I'm talking about bees and talking about data-driven versus data-informed decision-making so much at the start is to get us thinking about the lens through which we think about data. So often, when we have conversations about it, we talk about data telling us what to do. That without data, we can't make the next decision, or that rather, when we have got data, it will reveal the next step that we must take. We often talk about data as though it were a dictator to our actions. Instead, I want to challenge you to think of data as merely one input in your decision-making process. A really important one and a really valuable one, but just one input. Now, everything we're going to talk about from this point on in this session comes off the back of having spent the last year and a bit working with different L&D teams and spending a lot of time with them figuring out where they are with data and helping them get better at using data to inform their decisions. And I want to start by asking you the same question I often start by asking them, which is, if the slide changes, there we go, where is your data coming from? Now, in a minute, I'll talk through some of the common or most common responses that I've got and why there are some issues with some of them, or rather some limitations. But just in the chat, let me know where your data is coming from. LMS, intake system. Yep, these are great responses. And if you see the response that you're going to put already in there, please still put it in there. Brain, okay, like it. LMS. HubSpot, surveys, great, got some variety in there. LMS directly from trainers and surveys, love it. Cool, keep chucking your answers in there, everyone, because I'm sure there's loads. Spreadsheets, manual entry. I don't envy that job, but it's a phenomenal source of data. SMEs, focus groups, with a question mark. Are you getting data from them or not? But if you are or not, they're a great source of data. Directly from trainers, assessments, fantastic. So we've got a real rich variety of data sources already coming out. Now, the first challenge that I often run into when talking about data-informed decisions is but we don't have any data. Let me know in the chat. Does anyone here feel like they don't have data or that they have a lack of data in their organization? Because this is really interesting, and I found it's often shaped by the organization that you come from. Shannon, lack of data, interesting. Okay. So is anyone else feeling lack of data? Interesting. Numbers aren't data in and of themselves. Absolutely, absolutely. That numbers not being data. We're gonna talk about data in very broad senses throughout this session. But you're absolutely right. Inconsistencies in what's collected, absolutely. So I think here what we see there's a bit of a mix, but there seems here's an interesting one from Greg. We have tons of data, but we don't always have the right questions for the data. That's interesting. Lots of data, but how to make it meaningful? Data is too basic, no targeted KPIs. What is said versus what's reported, and it's too much data. I like that last one. Too much data is big data. We have a problem with analyzing data. That's really fascinating, and I find that actually that is the most common issue. It's almost never an actual lack of data. Now, it might be a lack of data that you know about or have access to, which is a different issue entirely. So I want to talk about those four most common that I spoke about before and some of the challenges they represent. So the most common by far source of data being used by learning and development teams, no surprise to anyone, is the LMS. LMS, LXP, LRS, we're going to group them all together under the banner of the LMS, but whatever platform you house your actual learning activity in, that is where the vast majority of L&D utilized data sits. Now, there's a strong argument to say that's some of the hardest, most accurate data you're going to get your hands on in terms of this happened, they did it, it happened on this date, they did this, they did that, they completed this, they completed that. But I would challenge you all ever so slightly, if this is your primary data source, to ask yourself, what is it actually telling you? Because the export of an LMS will generally give you a list of courses and a list of people who have or have not completed them and what they've scored on them. Now, it might also say, hey, they also gave this course a thumbs up, or 5 stars, or 3 stars, or probably more realistically, 1 or 2 stars. But what is this data actually telling you other than things that you have done? So we've got LMS data is not the most accurate source. It only tells us completion, not completed, passed, failed, number of attempts. But even if we had all that stuff, even if we had number of attempts and all this sort of stuff, the LMS is inherently somewhat limited in what it can tell you. It can only ever really give you data on how people have interacted something you've chosen to give them to interact with in some format. No matter how clever we think our content design is, we're designing it. We are creating an environment in which we're saying, hey, interact around this central hub, whether it's a course, whether it's a roundtable, whether it's a community chat. We are still putting that there in the space and saying, gather data on how they interact with this thing. It's not that that is bad data. It's not that it has no value. But we've got to be really careful that we do not treat it as the source of data in our decision-making process, because it will always, always represent what we asked it in the first place. The LMS is never going to throw out something you never would have thought of, because everything the LMS is things that you've thought of. You are creating the confines of your own solutions if all you look at is data coming out of the LMS. The LMS is, however, also a great place to harvest data. These limitations aside, it's probably the one platform most LMS teams have near total control over. As mentioned, you decide what goes on it. You decide, broadly speaking, how people interact with it. You decide the timeline. You have direct access to the data outputs. Which brings me on to the second most popular answer when I've run this across the year, which is that lots of data exists in siloed environments. Most organizations have a lot more data on everything than we tend to imagine them to. If we think about, oh, well, obviously Google and Facebook, etc., gather data on everything I do, most employers can pretty much do exactly the same thing on everything we do inside the work environment. How we interacted with the customer, how we use the work systems, how we're performing against our targets. This is all data that exists within organizations. Now, it exists in a variety of formats and on a variety of platforms. The biggest challenge is not actually conjuring this data into existence. It's in reaching out and working cross-functionally to pull in this data to the L&D world. The challenge most often faced by the teams that I've been working with has been the fact that they don't know where data is, they don't know who owns it, and they don't know how to get access to it. And this can be as simple as performance data, often held by HR or possibly operational line managers, or it could be something incredibly complex like how people are interacting with IT systems. Now, most IT departments will have the ability, if not the current action to, gather data on how people are interacting with their systems, whether that's through Windows or Google Analytics, or whether that's through much more specific programs like the sort of things that product teams use. The thing eludes me, Pendo is a good one for tracking user flows and following them through a system. Click on X button, get X solution, find yourself in this drop down. That level of usage information is available from most software at an operational sort of enterprise level. Knowing who to go to in your organization to open those conversations is really key to building a useful data set. Love this comment. LMS won't tell us anything about making overall data-driven learning solutions. Absolutely. Because fundamentally, the LMS is about learning, and learning is not anyone's job in the workplace. It's lovely, and I would love there to be a shred of truth in the learning is at the heart of what our business does. No, at the heart of every business is the desire to make as much money as possible. That's why it's a business and not a charity. And that's fine. That's a-okay. Because training, i.e. performance enablement, is at the heart of the business being able to deliver as much value to shareholders, to generate as much money, if you will, as possible. Learning, though, is not the point, but the point of the LMS is learning. So again, we limit ourselves to that world at our peril. All the data I was just talking about that's often siloed, the performance results, the behavioral observations that managers make about that lead to those performance results, often tied up with HR, often tied up in operational leadership. That IT data, often tied up in IT or DataSec maybe, or perhaps not gathered but readily available and ready to be gathered. These things are there. We don't take them often because we don't know they're potentially available to us. But in every instance that I've worked with a team that has gone out, they have found incredibly rich new data sources they never knew were available to them. Now, the other two here are slightly different to what I've mentioned so far. And the first one is opinion. Now, there's a very famous saying about opinions and how everyone's got them. We shan't go there. But I'd love to hear in the chat about what your view of gathering opinions is. And here I'm specifically talking about if we conduct a survey, if we conduct roundtables or focus groups, we're going to get opinions. We can't necessarily brand everything we're told from these sources as factual in the general sense. So I'd love to, again, jump into the chat. Let me know, what are your thoughts on gathering opinion from the business, from senior leaders, from stakeholders, from SMEs, from general employees in the business? They can provide insight. They're subjective. Absolutely. Survey and sensing sessions. Absolutely. So in terms of this data point, oh, Shannon, find the gaps. Remember that you said that phrase. We're going to talk about gaps a lot in a short while. Sentiment helps guide direction. Love it. They can be biased, but they're essential. Hannah, phenomenal point. Qualitative data is crucial alongside quantitative ones. Absolutely. That is pretty much the exact point I want to make of that opinion here. So often, when we talk about how we want to make data-informed decisions, or we want to be able to hold up data to explain why we've made the decision that we do, our minds jump to spreadsheets and graphs. Usually because they come in a nice little picture that we can put into a report and go, look, see, line going in this direction, that's why we did this. 9 times out of 10, that's going to be very difficult to do. You're almost always going to need to rely on some qualitative data to guide your decision making. In fact, I would go so far as to suggest that I've yet to see an example where quantitative data alone has actually been the solution, or has actually been the key to guiding the right solution. The qualitative input you're going to get, to an extent, is there to challenge or confirm the quantitative. Because the quantitative seems very exact, but actually leans into the next thing I'm going to talk about, which is how perception changes the meaning of data. So the same numbers can be presented in very similar ways, but giving very different meanings. We've all seen this, especially, I won't go into detail, but when you look at politics around the world, you can see how the same numbers can be presented in a very different way and the perception be totally different. So numbers alone can actually lead you in the wrong direction. There is a phenomenal book, and I love to give out book recommendations because books are magical things, called The Tyranny of Metrics. The Tyranny of Metrics talks a lot about how number chasing is a leading reason people fail to achieve their overall objective. Because numbers, being so exact, being so tangible, are very seductive. We must give equal credence to qualitative data because it will often be the thing that challenges the meaning of the numbers that we're looking at. It will provide context to the broader data set, and just occasionally it will upset you enough to consider changing your mind. And that is phenomenally important in this world. Because when we are in amongst the data, in amongst the numbers and the spreadsheets and the graphs and the thematic analysis and the comments, it's very easy to shut ourselves off to the real world around us and think that the data that we have collated is the sum total of the reality in which we are working. And it never is. The idea of a perfectly complete data set is a myth. We must always consider the fact that everything we think we know is fundamentally flawed because of one piece of information we've not got our hands on yet. And often, again, it is that qualitative nudge that we will get from someone in that different direction that will highlight that thing to us. So definitely check that book out. For all of these reasons, first big learning point, if you will, of this session, methodology matters. Where data comes from is important. How it was gathered is important. What you then do with it is important. And I said this wasn't going to be a maths or a statistics class or anything like that, but the one element that I want us to consider is that at the start of any good piece of research, at the start of any scientific publication, there will be a methodology. And it will outline exactly this. Where was the data collected? How was it collected? Who collected it? What was the purpose behind it? And what have you done with it? How have you gone from data to these outcomes? For us to be able to make genuinely data-informed decisions, we need to have not only a methodology that we follow and that we know, but that we can share, that we have documented, and that our SMEs, our stakeholders, and our wider business partners, especially senior leaders in our organization, have agreed to. So often when we talk about the barriers to taking a little bit of time to really understand the problem, to make better data-informed decisions, the challenge is no one will give me the time. People just want me to create something. They come to me with a solution. They push for training when it's not needed, whatever it might be. The best fix to this that I have found in my practice and with working with others is to have a declared, recorded, and pre-agreed to methodology for how your function engages with data. What this also does is gives people confidence in your decision-making ability. There's a phrase that I hate, which is that L&D needs a seat at the table. The table doesn't exist, but setting that issue aside, often the reason we're shut out of key decision making is that no one trusts our decision making process. You ask someone in a finance department, they will be able to tell you in great detail how they analyze risk and outlay and what's worth it and what's not. You go to someone who works in the operations department of a business, whatever kind of business it is, they will tell you how the supply chain works. They will tell you how the sales process works, how the quality assessment process works. Do we have the same thing? And we often say, oh, we do, kind of, we have ADDI or some other model. We'll touch on models later. But do we really have a stated methodology for how we decide that something is a 20-minute e-learning or a 3-day workshop or a comms piece or not a training problem? No matter what we do in terms of making better data-informed decisions, if we lack this agreed to methodology about how we engage with data, how can anyone trust that we actually know what we're doing when it comes to utilizing data to make decisions? Sorry, that's a large job you're going to have to do, but it is well worth it. It always lands well with the business. So next question I want to get on to: how do we get from data to action? Earlier, someone mentioned in the chat, forgive me, I can't remember your name, numbers aren't data. In a similar sense, data is never going to tell you, now build an e-learning, or this needs to be a workshop, or this is not a training problem. There is an element that only you can do here, and in between taking in this data and making a decision. And I said at the start that, like, I'm not a data analyst, a data scientist, a researcher, any of that stuff. This is the bit that I'm about. Because my solution to data analytics was to hire a data analyst, who in turn hired an automated platform to do some of the math stuff for them so that they could bring me the insights and I could think about what action we take. So how do we go from data, data points, collated data, to going, right, we're going to do this, and this is why? Analyze, develop, report. Cool. Sorry, pardon me for a minute. Oh, anyone else got any thoughts? It's okay if not, because it's incredibly difficult to actually state, how do you make decisions? Like, I've thrown that out there as a question, but it's really complicated. Like, how much of your decision making is conscious? How much of it can you explain? Even for something simple as, why did you create, this in blue rather than black, or whatever it might be, there'll be some deliberate, very clear decision reasons, and there'll be some others that are just like, oh, well, I just kind of know that this is the best way to do it. And you can see in that kind of feeling that we all get, all of us at some point, why people might not trust that process. Something based on training analysis, analyze the data, develop a plan with recommendations. So again, this is the thing. We kind of jump straight from, I would analyze the data and then I would create a plan. That's a big jump. Analyze and validate the data, interesting, yeah. Categorizing the data first, absolutely. So I'm going to offer up everyone's favorite thing, which is a model, about how I go about thinking about this. And I say thinking because after the model, I'll say something somewhat counterintuitive and you can kind of decide where you feel. But this is where we've landed after, again, working with a lot of clients and kind of changing this and adapting it. So this is as much their work as it has been mine, which is D.I.A.L. And you may be familiar with this. It is unapologetically stolen from the kind of broader data analytics world. We've tweaked it and adjusted certain bits of it. And it actually starts by taking a slightly less data driven starting point, which is to try and adopt a kind of assumed view of things. This is based on your own human insights. This is based on conversations and observations. This is based on your intuition as a professional. Now, often in conversations about data, we talk about setting aside all of that stuff. I've come to the view that that is not only an oversimplification, but a real risk. Because saying that there's no value in someone's professional intuition, the wealth of experience they have, is, for one thing, kind of rude, but also just not accurate. Like, there are so often situations in the world where someone who is new to a role will look at all the information and make a very logical, very data-driven decision that someone with 20 years experience says, you're about to run into this brick wall and let me tell you why. They save them from disaster, not based on assessing all the data out there, but based on experience. Based on having been there before, having done something similar. This is something that usually data fails to capture in any great accuracy because it happens on the sidelines, and business data tends to be targeted towards what the business cares about, not the things that actually happen in the business. Which sounds odd, but you all kind of know what I mean, right? The business says we're all about X, Y, and Z, and you actually know that day to day, maybe 10% of the business focuses on that, 10% at the top. The rest of you focus on generally other things that eventually lead into this. And then the other stuff that just happens. Because, and I love the fact that Laura Overton recently gave a fantastic talk at Connect about how the world of work is messy and nothing is done in straight lines. And sometimes data can create the illusion that things move in straight lines, that this happened, then that happened, and therefore there is there a link? We don't know. So start with an assumed view of the world. Know that it's an assumption. Assumptions aren't bad. Assumptions are what has allowed us to survive and get through day-to-day life for a very long time. So long as we know we're making assumptions, it's all good. With this assumed view of the situation, an assumed view of how we might resolve the situation, we then investigate. We turn to our gathered data sources. This should be all kinds of data, qualitative, quantitative, performance data, LMS data, human gathered comments and resources, IT data about how people interact with things. What we're looking for here, quite simply, are things that don't align, things that don't add up. Some of that data will hopefully go, hey, you were spot on about this bit of your assumption. Cool, set that to one side, no longer interested. If we think that's right, brilliant, let's move on. We're looking for those magic little moments where the data says, you're fundamentally wrong here. What the data can't necessarily tell us is why we're wrong. Because we're now challenging assumption or perception, if you will, with hard data. Or sometimes soft data in the forms of comments, but some form of data. This tells us where we need to investigate further, where we need to dive in and say, okay, so why is there this gap? Why do I think, based on my experience, my intuition, something fundamentally different to what the data is telling me? This is where we start to adjust. We start to think about what needs to change here and why does this gap exist? Now, the easy answer would be to say, the data's right, just change your assumption. That works some of the time. Some of the time, there is an issue with your data. Sometimes the data could actually be wrong. That's something we often don't consider enough. But sometimes the data might lack context. Sometimes this context may have never come up before. Sometimes there's a fundamental shift in what the business does or the environment in which we operate. Look at the world today, look at the world a year ago. Data will tell us that certain things have certain reactions, and those things have fundamentally changed. An example from Britain at the moment is we want farmers to be more environmentally friendly. Yes, of course we do. Great, we've done that. We absolutely hate it and we're having protests about it. Data is not forever true, although it will continue to say the same thing. What that data means changes over time and changes with context. So, really important that when we talk about adjusting that assumed worldview, we are not talking about just adopting whatever the data has said. We're talking about a really considered approach of thinking about why there is a difference, what that difference can tell us, and how we can investigate that difference. And almost always that is going to mean gathering more data. It's going to mean having conversations with people. It's going to mean going to a different department and saying, hey, we're noticing this. Are you seeing it here? It's going to be showing this to another person, maybe in your function, maybe not, and saying, would you come at this with the same assumption? And would you run into the same challenge? This is one of those situations where, as much as I love working on my own in my office and getting into detail, it pays to have a network of people that you can go to and say, hey, take a look at this. Finally, once you've worked through that, once you've adjusted that view, you get to what could best be described as kind of a blend of assumption and data-informed sort of reality. You are never going to be in a situation where you know absolutely everything's 100% accurate. If you did, life would be really, really boring and our job would be really, really easy. It's not going to happen. Sorry. Instead, we end up in a world where we are reasonably certain of X, Y, and Z, and perhaps a little bit less certain of these other things over here. So, we don't want to use this and go, let's create a 6-month plan that we launch in 9 months' time, having spent all this time and all this resource and all this money to create. So instead, we start to think about the world of software development. I know, hard pivot. Only for a moment though. They work in sprints. And I'm not going to touch on the broader agile methodology. I actually don't think it translates that well to the L&D world. But I think working in sprints is a very good way for us to think about how we make better data-informed decisions. Because having gone through this whole process, we don't want to tie ourselves into, we now know the facts, let's do this. Instead, let's ask ourselves, how can we use what we now know to deliver value in the next 2 weeks? What can we do? Let's do it. Let's see what happens. Let's do another 2 weeks, in which time we can look at the results of the first 2 weeks and then course correct and then change and then challenge. Because everything we do, everything we introduce to the business creates new data that we need to constantly feed back. Leveraging this decision-making process is not just making a decision and implementing, it's making a decision, implementing, and then starting again. And constantly feeding in the outputs every 2 weeks of what you have done. Now, you are not going to do 2 weeks forever, especially if it's a big thing you're trying to achieve, like overhauling an induction program. But what you can do is do this at first. And as the amount of assumption that's left in your decision gets smaller and smaller, and more of it is proven to be accurate, you can start extending those periods out, where perhaps you don't have to keep everything so small. Because some things are big, right? Developing large pieces of content might take longer, but if you can release an MVP in 2 weeks, you're better off doing that to get the feedback earlier. This is where you can work in the world of pilot groups. This is where everything you do is about testing an assumption, not jumping straight to solving the problem. And again, this is where having that methodology really pays off, because otherwise there is a danger that this is seen as indulgent, wasteful even. In fact, it's a really efficient way of working. Because as it stands, a terrifying number of our programs, our initiatives go out there into the world, and we've probably all felt it at some point and gone, that didn't quite do what I wanted it to do. This is a way of catching that earlier and rolling that back in as a useful data point rather than saying, well, we messed up, but we spent the money, we spent the resource, we're out of time, this is what we're left with. We better run another workshop to fix it. This is an opportunity to hopefully never again make a big mistake. Now, having said all of that about D.I.A.L, the most important thing to take away from this section is that models don't matter. My objective with that whole conversation there is not to have you all go away and use D.I.A.L. It's for you to think about what your decision-making process looks like. It might be that you look at D.I.A.L and think, yes. I can see in the conversation in the chat, we've got D.I.A. D.I.A. is phenomenal. Sort of, again, from the world of data analysis, great model to look at. The specific model that you use is not important. It doesn't matter. What matters is that you are able to make data-informed decisions, demonstrate that to your business, and communicate your decision-making process to those around you, both that you work with, your peers, and those who you report into, to justify what you have done. What I really love about D.I.A.L specifically is that it allows you to blend in that natural creativity, that intuition that we all bring to the work that we do, and that we really don't want to surrender, because that experience is hard won. We've had to work hard to get that. We don't want to surrender it just so that we can be utilizing data. We need to be blending the two to make the best possible decision, but that requires us to be able to explain that process. Because otherwise it sounds like we're saying, well, the data says this, but I'm choosing to ignore it because I feel differently. No, it's because the assumption is not completely challenged by the data point is out of context, whatever the conversation around that might be. You need to go through that kind of discovery, investigation, and adjustment before you can meaningfully challenge data with your intuition. So with all that in mind, let's talk about how you can be taking the credit that you're due. Or, as some other people might call it, communicating data for influence. Look, no one wants to be given a spreadsheet. No one wants another dashboard full of graphs. And no one, and I mean this, no one wants to be sent a 32-page complex thematic analysis to justify your decision making. In all three of those cases, you're probably going to get a very polite response email saying, thank you so much for this, it was fascinating. And we all kind of know that that means they didn't read it. So, there are four things I want to touch on when we come to communicating data, because this is a huge opportunity for us to not only demonstrate and justify our decision making, but add value to other functions. All those teams that we went out to when I said about working cross-functionally and gathered data from, we can now say a big thank you by giving them insight back in return. Now, the first thing is, and please do chime in the chat with your top tips of communicating this back to your business, clarity. Every bit of insight you put out to the business should be clear. Now, this sounds obvious, but whenever we talk about data or data-informed insight, we tend to start going, well, I need to talk about the numbers, and I need to talk about this, I need to talk about where it came from, I need to talk about... Just give them the thing they're interested in. Be very clear. This is for this context, this is for these people, here's what it means, here's what we've done. That's it. That's what's needed. Which leads me into the second one, which is brevity. Give people what they need and no more. You've done a whole bunch of phenomenal work. You've done the collection, you've done the analysis, you've done all this wonderful thinking. You could probably write like a 200-page report, including appendices and data visualizations. No one wants to see that, unfortunately. You should be really proud of the work you and your team have done to make this great decision, But what most other teams and other departments, and especially the C-suite, need is like a paragraph telling them that you've looked at X, Y, and Z, and this is the decision. You now know this. This is the decision. Yes, they may want the option to deep dive into some data, but don't lead with it. Executive summaries rule the world of data and research. The vast majority of papers out there only ever get the executive summaries read. For good reason. If I don't need to see every step that got you here, and all I'm interested in, so what are we doing and how did we get there, that's all I need to be told. Give people the option to dive in deeper rather than trying to force them to. Next thing, and you'll all be familiar with this, is storytelling. Simply presenting people with data, simply telling them you've made a decision, isn't really going to bring them along for the ride. It's not going to change how they think about you, your function, or your decision-making processes, or your decision-making prowess, if you will. So instead, in that executive summary, in that in-the-room conversation, in that 5-minute conversation in the lift or the elevator, tell them a story. Tell them about the journey you've been on. Tell them about the challenges. Tell them about the ups and downs. Tell them about the complications. Most importantly, tell them about what it means to them. Put them in this story. Because if you're the hero of your own story here, you're kind of just grandstanding. And you can get the credit you're due, but only if you make them the hero of this story. What are you enabling them to do? Because this whole journey, everything we do as an L&D function is as a servant to the wider organization. We don't lead, we don't set organizational objectives. The C-suite and our CEOs and all these kind of operational leaders are saying, hey, we need to achieve, X, Y, and Z billions of growth, or whatever it might be in your organization, depending on scale and size and objective. We need to attach our data-informed decision and the journey we took to get there to their vision, in which they almost universally are the heroes. That's their special credit gift, right, for being in charge. And if we want, whether we call it a seat at the table or just to be taken seriously and have our decisions trusted and be allowed to spend more time in this early understand and investigation stage, we've got to make them the hero of that story. We've got to bring them with us. Right the way from, hey, we got to this place and it's been really effective. And actually in these 2-week stints, we're on week 12 now, and we've already seen these results. But none of this would have been possible had we not have started with a week taken out to look at all these data points and to consider how that tracked with what we thought, and we challenged our assumptions and we did all this. The messy stuff at the beginning is what allows the end story to be tidy. But that tidy story in which they are the hero and you facilitate their success will enable them to say yes to more messy beginnings, more analysis, more time to understand the problem, more time to make great data-informed decisions. The last thing, and this is a bit of a shorter one, usefulness. If someone has no use for the insight you have created, don't hit them over the head with it. Take it to the people that need it. Take it to the people who want it. Take it to the people who you think could benefit from it but haven't realized it's available or haven't asked for it yet. But do not walk around the business going, hey, we discovered some stuff, let me tell you about it, to the people who could not care less. You force this stuff on people at your own peril. Because if we do waste people's time telling them about information, these incredible insights that we found very useful that are of no use to them, we're back to being ineffective, inefficient, waste of time, waste of resource. Just do it quickly, just do what you're told. So make sure that whenever you're communicating this data, these insights, your decision-making process out to people, that it is always through the lens of being useful to them. What does it mean to them? Whether it's what you've trained their team in, whether it's how they can use this data, this insight that you've generated to make better decisions themselves, whether it's a challenge on a decision they have made and said, hey, I'm not sure if you're aware of this. We went down a similar road, and here's some stuff that we discovered that I thought you might find useful. That is how we can take all this cross-functional work that's gone into getting us to a good decision from an L&D perspective and utilize it highly efficiently to help other business functions make better decisions as well. So the last of the three kind of big in capital learning slides, start small and start today. The biggest thing that has held up almost every client I've worked with over the past year is that they are terrified of doing the first one. How do I get started? The smallest project you can find. Don't try and roll this out when it's time to overhaul the entire ecosystem. Do this when it's time to update some small bit of content no one really cares about. Do this when it's time to make a change within a relatively, with a team that you've got a relatively good working relationship with already. Don't try and roll this out when you're facing your nemesis department that hates L&D and you and everything you stand for. It's the wrong time to be trying something new. And look for that opportunity today. There will never be a better time to start making better decisions than at your next decision point. So I said before that I wanted people to get as involved as possible. I want to thank you for sharing so much in the chat. I came very close to running over time, as is my general way. So if you do have any questions or have a chat about data or L&D or anything else for that matter, reach out to me. I won't try and sell you anything, I promise. Just always happy to have a chat about L&D. And if you have got any questions or want to challenge anything you've heard, please do jump into the chat or the Q&A now.
Thanks so much, Tom. This was absolutely fantastic. It was lovely seeing the chat so very energetic.
Yeah, I find this is one of those topics where you go, oh, data and decision making processes. Oh yeah, I suppose that's interesting. Once people get talking about it, we realize it's fascinating because no two people think about this in exactly the same way.
It is.
That's why I love talking about it so much.
Definitely. If anyone has a question, go ahead and toss it into the Q&A or even in the chat because we're not going so fast. Yes, you will also get a copy of this wonderful video because we did record it. The webinar, it will be served up into your inbox tomorrow, so keep an eye out for it before noon Eastern time. And any and all assets. I think everybody did actually see the link that I put in about the book that Tom recommended. I'll see if I can put that link in the follow-up email as well. And please, as you're leaving, there's going to be an exit survey. We would love your opinion. We're also going to possibly give away $100 gift card to Amazon, wherever you are. Just saying. So for those people who fill out the survey, we will enter you into that drawing. So, all right, we do actually have one question. I'm gonna
Oh,
put it up. Oh, I didn't get the links to any videos from yesterday. Any chance I could get those? It should be in your inbox right about now. Please check your spam. And you can always email me directly at knos@elblearning.com. And I will also put that in the chat right now. If I can find my chat again. There we go. There's my email.
and obviously, if you win that gift voucher, you can go and buy yourself a book.
Ah,
That's
there you go. I like that idea.
my boring brain. I've got money. I can buy books. Amazing.
Books are fantastic. Oh, somebody just asked if we could possibly share the link again. So we're going to do that. See if I can snag it. I'm relearning on my computer all over again. There we go. All right. Well, it looks like we're going to wrap this up. Thank you so much, everybody, for showing up today, especially you, Tom. It's always good to see
My
you,
pleasure.
and hopefully we'll have you do some more webinars coming up for us in 2025. And thank you so much for being here. We do have one more day of ELBX online if you want to check out our other presentations, feel free to go to elblearning.com, click on the banner, and find some content that you would like to consume. And if you don't, have a happy holiday, and we'll see you in 2025.